So I want to just welcome you all once again to the webinar. To mark International Women's Day, which was actually yesterday, the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills mined a few of its key surveys, including PISA, Education at a Glance, and the Survey of Adult Skills, to get a clearer view of the gender gaps in education and employment that stubbornly persist. Andreas Schleicher, Director of the Education and Skills, will describe what we found and offer some insights into how we can narrow these gaps. If you have any questions for Andreas, please feel free to send them to Eric Magnuson using the chat function at any time during the presentation. Andreas?
Thanks so much, Marilyn. And what I wanted to talk about is, on the one hand, the great success in education and getting more, women better skills today. Gender gaps are almost disappearing when we look at the skills of people directly. But at the same time, there are many hidden gaps that prevent women with good skills actually to get to the kind of jobs that will extract best value from. So there is this gap between, on the one hand, educational attainment and persistent gaps in labor market outcomes. And we've also been surveying some of the attitudes that underpin to what extent have boys and girls positive attitudes to some of the knowledge and skills that are going to be crucial for their success in the future. So let's start with some data. First, how boys and girls actually perform in schools. The first thing you can see through our PISA assessments, that's age 15, is that girls perform better in reading than boys in every country and economy. And I want to keep you this in mind, because later on when I look at skills in the adult labor force, the picture is very, very different. So for young people in school, actually girls are way ahead over boys. And when you look at the skill as a score differences, 30 score points on the PIAC scale, that's pretty much equivalent to a full year in schooling. So when you look in science, it's pretty even. In some countries on the left side, you can see basically boys, basically girls, this is girls minus boys. So basically boys have an advantage. On the right side, you can see girls have an advantage, but it's pretty much even out on average. We don't have a big kind of difference left. Mathematics is the only area where you can see boys in the majority of countries being at an advantage. You can see that on the left side. In most countries, you can see boys coming out better on the PISA test at age 15. In a few countries on the right side, it is girls. But so basically, big advantage in reading, even out in science, small advantage in mathematics for boys. So let's look at how those gender gaps actually square with overall performance. And that's actually very interesting. You have countries basically all over the place. There are some where, the average, there's a below average gender gap. So countries doing quite well on gender equity. They're on the left side of the chart and they do well. Provinces in China, Singapore, Macau, Korea, and so on. They have actually been able to minimize gender gaps in reading and at the same time do really well. You have some countries that don't do well. They're below the horizontal line and show above average gender gap here on the right side. And then you have some countries where, they're strong in one or the other. But the point really is there's no cross-country relationship. So in order to minimize gender gaps, you don't need to give up on strong performance. You can actually achieve strong performance and a small gender gap both at the same time. At least some countries have done quite well on that. When you look at the top performers, the picture is quite interesting. Among the top performers in reading, you can see in most countries, girls do better than boys. Among the advantaged socioeconomic groups, students who come from wealthier homes, who have better educated parents and things like this. You can really see the percentage of top performers in reading is a clear advantage for girls, both among privileged students. When you look at this in mathematics, you can see the opposite. Boys perform markedly better among advantaged socioeconomic groups. In general, you can say that while overall in mathematics the score point advantage for boys is not very important, among the top performers, boys are heavily overrepresented. And again, social background seems to reinforce that picture to some extent. Now, let's look beyond the kind of surface. When we see, for example, enjoyment with reading, you can see in every country girls enjoy reading more than boys. Now, the overall level of enjoyment varies quite a bit across countries, but the pattern that girls are more, joyful when it comes to reading is something that we see across countries. And that is about 15-year-olds in school. So probably education and schooling have a lot to do with this. We also see that boys and girls differ quite a bit in how much they engage with different technology activities. Now you can see, for example, when it comes to ICT use with based reading is one of my favorite hobbies. You can see that's true for girls. Participating in social networks, also more prevalent for girls. Chatting online, a little bit more for girls. But when you look at playing online games via social networks, you can see that's a lot more frequently happening for boys. Playing one-player games and playing collaborative games, that's where the advantage of boys, or the prevalence of those activities for boys, gets very significant. So this is important. It's the nature of technology-related activities that varies quite a bit across boys and girls. And when you look at overall intensity of technology use, those things wash out. You can see a similar picture, but actually the nature of technology use is quite different in this. Let me sort of, again, drill down even further. What we can see here is that differences in the activities students highlight. First of all, let me just show you. Girls are more motivated to master difficult tasks than boys. That's quite a consistent pattern across countries. So task motivation, again, and that's an important attribute also for success in not in school, just in life in general. To what extent are you willing to tackle task? At least what the self-reports suggest that's more common for girls than for boys. In the vast majority of countries, there are just sort of a few patterns where this is going the other way. Let's sort of look at competition. There you can see that boys have stronger attitudes towards competition than girls. Not in every country. No, in some countries you can see the opposite happen, but sort of competitive learning styles, competitive work environments in schools is something that boys seem to be more comfortable with than girls. And again, competition can be one attribute for success in some situations. It can be a hindrance in other kinds of environments. Boys are also less afraid of failure than girls. And again, being afraid of failure is not a good thing when you want to be innovative. Innovation is about, creativeness. Innovation is about, being able to take risks. And if you take risks, you're going to make mistakes. If you are afraid of mistakes, you're probably not going to be as innovative. And there you can see really that is a quite consistent pattern across most countries, that girls are more afraid of failure than boys in the countries for which we have data. So what impact could these attitudes have later in life on differences in career expectations, differences in the field of study that people choose, or differences in the labor market outcomes? Hard to assess, but we have some really interesting data from our indicators on this. First of all, we ask 15-year-olds what they want to do in their lives, what kind of careers they aspire to. And here you can see the top career aspirations of 15-year-old boys and girls, and you can see they're quite different. For boys, things like police officer, sports players, engineering professional, general medical practitioners were rated very high. For girls, it was about medical jobs, and lawyers and teaching professionals. So you can really see at age 15, those kinds of career aspirations diverge quite a bit between boys and girls. And you cannot predict those with the PISA scores, the cognitive outcomes, because boys and girls do equally well. But when you look at the kind of social and emotional attachment to different subjects, you get part of the explanations. So this is a very interesting kind of nuance that the latest PISA round has added to this. It looked at career aspirations of young people and then squared that with gender, with social background, with geography and other factors. And this is an illustration of this. When you look, for example, who wants to become a science and engineering professional, and I just take the top performers in science here, actually mathematics and science. So I look at the students who did really well on the PISA math and science test. And you can see, I mean, all of them would be, well positioned to become scientists. But you can see the prevalence of boys who express the wish to become a science and engineering professional is much higher in most countries than it is for girls. The only exceptions are mainly Eastern European countries. That's Eastern and sometimes Central European countries. That's for some reason, actually, boys and girls come out quite equal in their aspirations. Unfortunately, mostly at a lower level, but at least you don't see that kind of gender patterns as much. So, and I want to highlight again, this is not, girls not doing so well in science, therefore they don't want to become scientists. I'm only looking at the boys and girls who did really well in math and science. And there you can see, even in those who are well positioned, you can see huge gender gaps. And surprise, surprise, when you match that to the chart I just showed you before, that's exactly what you then see in the actual career destinations of young people. And for girls, it's the opposite when it comes to health-related professions. Now here you can see, look at the top performers among all students, and you can see girls are much more likely to aspire to health-related occupations than boys do. Irrespective, this is basically netting out performance. And when you look at this at tertiary level, you can also see sort of quite distinct gender patterns. Among here you can see basically among 25 to 64-year-old adults, the distribution of male graduates. You can see it health and welfare, education, natural science, and engineering. And then on the right side, you can see the distribution of female-related, recent graduates and tertiary educated 15-year-olds. And you can see again, that gives you a sense of how the evolution is going to take place. For example, on the left side, you can see for graduates, the picture is a little bit better than for the older generations or for the whole population. On the right side, it's a lot more evenly out. So basically, field of study choices at the tertiary level tend to mirror what you could see from the previous slide in terms of career expectations from school. So actually what 15-year-olds tell us about their career expectations is something that is not so dissimilar than what current, people in that age group choose later in their study. In other words, what people have in their minds is probably going to materialize. Later on, at least it happened for the previous kind of cohort. Just see that I can advance the slide. Now, let's look at labor market outcomes. This is basically showing the evolution of the gender gap in literacy and numeracy over time. You can see for age 9 and 10, the girls' advantage in reading is sort of diminishing. Age 15 is going the other way. It's bigger. That's basically the kind of PISA age that we measured. But when I look at 26 to 27, you can say in reading, it flips the other way. Basically, men are at an advantage there. Now, to some extent, that could be a cohort effect, but actually many studies suggest that it's more likely to be an effect of men ending up in occupations that are more literacy intensive, where they use their literacy skills better and therefore sort of they retain and develop their skills more so than women do. At least that's the kind of hypothesis that is supported by most of the studies that we have. And in numeracy, you can see the same pattern. Basically, again, you can see a small advantage at age 9 and 10, a little bit bigger advantage at 15 and 16, and a huge advantage for older youth when it comes to numeracy skills. So that's something that we need to keep in mind, that actually what we do in school can position people, but the choices they make afterwards and how they use their skills is going to be probably another factor contributing to the skill distribution that we see later in life. So cognitive outcomes early in life may not predict, the skills that people have when we measure them at some point later. And often because of the kind of choices that people make in the workplace. So that's a very important kind of facet to keep in mind. And you can do that by country. So you can see actually the picture is pretty consistent by country now in all countries. The numeracy gap in the kind of 26 to 27-year-old population is bigger than it was in the primary kind of age group. And for the middle 15 to 16, it's perhaps not that clear. Literacy gap, I highlight this is also, you can see how it really tends to, for the older, the advantage of women disappears and turns often, sometimes in a significant advantage for men. So once again, how you use your skills in the workplace may be as predictive as the skills that you get from early in schooling. We also know, and this is published in our annual edition, Education at a Glance, that women tend to receive lower relative net financial returns on investing in tertiary education than men. And what I mean by this is that we have evened out any kind of incidence and intensity of part-time work. So this is really, in a way, sort of the kind of net kind of returns that we can see after look at all of the costs that people have incurred. The returns are very positive for both men and women, but they tend to be lower, systematically lower for women. Basically, women with similar degrees earn less than men in most, not all, but most of the countries for which we have comparative data. Now, on the right side, you can see some countries where that is not the case, but particularly on the left side, where labor markets are very responsive to skills, you can see that in a wage gap for similar skills being quite prominent and quite important. We also see that on average, with a degree in the same field of study, women's earnings in the workplace are lower than the earnings of men's. Now, that's true across tertiary education. You've just seen that. But it's also true in technology, even more so in technology-related fields and business-related fields, and even in education. And that's perhaps the biggest surprise, because you think those people are public employees at schools and so on. But it shows that actually some education-related jobs for tertiary graduates are better paid for men. So something that we can also see by field of study. If I sum all of this up, again, the schooling outcomes look fine. Actually, education has made huge strides to close the gender gap in learning outcomes, but with the underpinning attitudes that boys and girls have, for example, to the extent to which science open life opportunities to you, or to what extent role models shape the kind of image that people have of certain occupational destinations, they may be more influential in terms of shaping career destinations of men and women, which then in turn have huge implications on further skill development. You could see that the kind of advantage of women disappearing in the early years of labor market exposure, and obviously can also translate into employment and earnings outcomes, as you can see. So in a nutshell, when you think about this in terms of policies and practices, it's not so much about the cognitive outcomes, but it's more about giving people early in their lives realistic appreciation of what they can do with their skills, their full range of skills, and a good understanding of what possible opportunities are. And then, that can then be reinforced through the labor market. That's just sort of a few points I wanted to make. So early interventions that promotes girls' self-confidence and willingness to compete. Competition also, you could see that boys have more positive attitudes towards competition than girls. Those things do matter. And then obviously promoting understanding among teachers and employers on differences in gender attitudes and self-promotion. Now, that's about, how can employers, in the early stages of people's development, but also later in the workplace, promote a good utilization of the talent that we have. Because obviously, the more effective we draw value from our talent, from men and women, the more productive our societies and economies will be. So I leave it here to give you enough time for questions, and I have with me my colleague Marta Enciles Martin, who's actually been the mastermind of this analysis, who's drawn together all of the data from our different surveys and analysis for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Yes, we already do have several questions. Um, I'd like to also read a little preface of some questions that came to us from one of the participants who's actually from the European Commission. And this participant writes, "It is my concern that public institutions waste precious time and resources discussing the gender factor at the expense of other much more powerful factors that determine students' success or failure, both academically and professionally." He goes on to write that a major meta-analysis of data from 1914 through 2011 revealed that for the past 100 years, girls have always outperformed boys in school, not only in reading, but also in maths and science, yet policymakers seem obsessed with girls in STEM. He therefore has a few questions. Before his questions, though, he does say that PISA shows that in high school, both genders express the same level of interest in pursuing STEM careers. Some 25% of boys and 24% of girls expect to be working in a science-related occupation when they are 30 years old. However, there is a large difference between the genders in terms of their chosen field. Girls gravitate towards biomedical sciences, while boys more often choose physical sciences and computer technologies. So his questions are as follows, and I'll read them all together because they all play off of each other. First, is there any evidence about the socioeconomic significance of the above described gender differences in the professional choices that young people make? Is this a problem? And is there any reliable evidence that this difference negatively affects society at large? What are the reasons for the fact that girls prefer to work in some specific fields while boys are more inclined towards others? Are the reasons for those choices economic or are they educational? And if it's the latter, then what could be offered as a possible policy intervention at the school level to try to shrink these gender gaps? Do you want to answer that, either of you?
Yeah, I think these are really good questions. And first of all, that chimes well with our own analysis. We have actually shown very much the same kind of data. So you can argue, yeah, there is an equal share of boys and girls aiming for STEM careers. But when you look at actually entry to those programs later in life, you can see very big gender distortions. So in a way, and you can see also when you survey 15-year-olds on their occupational destination, you can see that boys want to become science and engineering professionals, which typically are attached to higher earnings and good employment, and girls, prefer the more health-related careers. So that in our kind of economies often are, linked to lower earnings outcomes. So that those kind of choices have big implications for the careers of people. So STEM doesn't mean very much because that's kind of a big bucket in which we throw a lot of things. But once you unpack that, you can actually see very important gender differences that are not mirrored in cognitive scores. You were absolutely right that, boys and girls do equally well on science. I don't think that's always been the case. When you look actually at data from the 50s and 60s, that was not the case, but certainly is now the case. But it's those underlying attitudes. Now, you can argue, well, does it matter whether those jobs are chosen by men and women from a societal point of view? I think society should have an interest to use the talent they have in the most effective and efficient ways and make sure that people get the jobs they're best suited for. And that doesn't seem to be the case in the data that we have. You can ask, and the last question is the most interesting, where does this come from? And our analysis, a lot of this has to do with role models early in life. There's an interesting study by, the charity Education Employers that ask, children in kindergarten to draw their kind of occupations. You could see the same kind of gender stereotypes that we can see on the PISA already at the age of kindergarten. Basically, career exposure is a very, very important factor. Now, if you have never seen a female engineer, why would you study hard in those kinds of fields in science that give you that kind of opportunity later in life? So I think role models clearly are very important. We saw the same in PISA. when we basically looked at parents' attitudes to the children's occupation. Parents were a lot, even after netting out science performance, parents were a lot more likely to expect their boys to become engineers than their girls. So again, I think there are many societal factors that reinforce those kinds of stereotypes, and I would argue it's not a good thing because it means that many uh, girls and boys will not, end up in the kind of destinations for which they probably are the best fit. That would be my take on this.
Thank you. I have a couple of other questions forthcoming. Is the fear of failure self-reported? If so, this might result in some bias, as boys might be less willing to acknowledge fear of failure than girls. And a related question, is the tool that is used to capture students' attitudes available?
Yeah, actually, the questionnaires are all available from the OECD, and the fear of failure is self-reported. But we don't ask people, are you afraid of failure? We ask them very specific questions about this, so to minimize the kind of cognitive bias that you might have. So yeah, there is a possibility that the kind of acknowledgement of failure might play a role, but even that, could be influential in how you approach life and a failure in real life. So yeah. I think the bottom line is it's self-reported data, but we try to minimize any bias in the way we pose and frame those questions. And those questions are available from the OECD.
Another question related to competition. Is the problem the fact that girls are not competitive enough, or is that the problem that the competition that's created by grades is the real culprit in this?
That's an interesting question. In fact, one of the most interesting findings from that study is that we should not see collaboration and competition or attitudes towards collaboration and competition and conflict. In fact, you have some young boys and girls who are, have a preference for both of them. They see sort of both collaborative and competitive attitudes as a very positive thing. When it comes to outcomes, we can also see that both competitive and collaborative attitudes relate positively towards better learning outcomes among the same students. And most interestingly, the interesting difference comes when we look at social emotional outcomes. There you can say competitive attitudes tend to be less well related to well-being, as cooperative attitudes are, more highly related. So I wouldn't say that competition in the system is a negative thing. I think, again, if we don't see that as a kind of, spectrum from competition to collaboration, where you have, both are opposing ends on a spectrum, but rather as sometimes mutually reinforcing attitudes, I think, and that's the way I would look at this. Then you could argue that it would be good for girls to not only do well on the kind of more collaborative aspects, but also to become better at the competitive edges now.
Thank you. Another question. Hang on one second. Another question here. Do the gender gaps in education start appearing at a certain age, or are they present from the very beginning?
And that's a very interesting question that we cannot really answer with the evidence that we currently have, because most of our assessment only starts at age 15, and we have some data from age 10 and a little bit of data from the early years. But that's something that our current data sources do not allow to answer. Some people would say, maybe even early childhood education, like the study that I cited from Education Employers, suggests that that starts really, really early. Now, career exposure might start even well, and career attitudes might actually be entrenched quite well in the very early years of primary school and before, suggesting also that that's maybe where we need to work hardest on role models and exposure. But we don't have real quantitative data to prove that.
We have another question asking for some more potentially concrete information. Are you aware of any country or countries that have managed to significantly reduce the gender gaps in education? And if so, do you know how they did that and what methods they used?
In the field of STEM, I think Italy is a good example where STEM gender patterns used to be very, very pronounced in the early 2000s, and in a relatively short period, we're talking here about 5-6 years, they were able to reverse that with very deliberate campaigns, a lot about focus on removing gender stereotyping from textbooks, from instructional practice, emphasizing career exposure. I can't tell you the. It was sort of in the latter halves of the 2000s where that change was observed. I think this highlights actually that these are issues that are not. We're not talking about anything that is in the genes of people or in the genes of societies. Things like culture. I actually think that education. Those examples show that education can make a big difference in relatively short periods of time. In fact, I would make that argument for education as a whole. The reduction of the gender gap in cognitive outcomes and education attainment is a huge success of education over the last 20, 30 years.
Thank you. I have a couple of more STEM questions here. One participant asked, there is analysis by some scholars that women simply do the numbers and decide that pursuing STEM careers simply doesn't pay in terms of time and effort. Isn't this a more powerful factor than the role models or other soft factors?
I don't think that's really borne out by the data. Again, the health-related professions that in the STEM fields that girls tend to prioritize are actually the less paying jobs, at least today. So I am not sure I understand that argument. I think if you do make the numbers, investing in STEM is actually quite good investment for people.
Another participant asked, do we have any evidence yet on how employers are changing their attitudes towards hiring women?
We don't have from our surveys that we have summarized here that kind of data. That's another very important kind of perspective, but here we look really from the individual's perspective.
Sorry, we have another question concerning competition and cooperation. If there is not a spectrum between competition and cooperation, isn't it likely that competition is of a different nature in a cooperative environment?
Yeah, I think so. Again, if we design, innovative learning environments, we'll probably embed both cooperative and competitive elements in this. Now, I think sports competitions are a good example where, you will only succeed to be competitive if you're also collaborative. And I think the same is something that we could do in mathematics and science. Unfortunately, is often not taking place. Unfortunately, we make this a zero-sum game. If some people do better, others need to do worse, and that I think is a negative kind of incentivizer. But I do see many opportunities for education and training to link collaboration and cooperation in a way that it's actually mutually reinforcing.
Do we have any data on whether all girls' schools help or hinder girls' self-confidence and willingness to compete?
That's actually a good question. And unfortunately, our data sources, the sample sizes are not large enough to answer that question conclusively. But I think it's something that deserves better analysis.
Another question about boys and the fact that they seem to catch up to girls vis-a-vis literacy as they get older. Do we perceive it as something that has to do is peer related, that perhaps in secondary school, boys do not consider it cool to be a reader, whereas later on in life or as a young adult, boys realize or young men realize that they have to read to actually succeed?
Yeah, that's the way we interpret this data as well. As I said before, there might be a small cohort effect, simply education has progressed more for girls and for boys, but the big effect is not explained by this. The big effect is most likely to be related to skill use at the workplace. At the workplace, young men end up more in jobs that actually are literacy intensive, and then they figure out that, and probably that use of literacy practices will then become a predictor for actually investing in better literacy skills. That's our hypothesis, but again, it's very hard to prove that.
Okay. When it comes, we have another question just arriving here. I'm sorry. When it comes to competition and failure, is there any evidence that boys and girls are given different opportunities? Are they treated differently? Might boys be more trained in competition because they can also fail but continue?
I don't think we can answer that question from the data that we have. I would consider this relatively hard to conceive in areas like math, science, and sort of the school subjects where learning is highly structured. In less structured environments, it might well be an explanation. Now that boys either self-choose subjects where they can exercise more competition, but we in the data we just see the result, and the drivers of that are very hard to underpin. But if you sit in a classroom that is highly structured, it's not so obvious how those factors would play out. But again, if in the afternoon, or you can choose subjects in which you can exercise more competition clubs and so on, that probably could be a factor. No.
Another question, what would be your key recommendation or recommendations to address the gender gap, apart from asking women and girls to be more competitive?
Yeah, I think what this data all show is that we need to start very early, and then also to focus a lot more on the non-cognitive, the social and emotional factors, rather than the cognitive ones. Now, on the cognitive side, education is done pretty well, but when I look at social emotional attachment, there we see these big gender gaps that then later on become very powerful predictor of actual study choices. So if I could only do one thing, I would start on career exposure, particularly for students, boys and girls from disadvantaged backgrounds, to make sure that they see the world with all of its facets, that they see their own potential, and they can actually make the investments to reap their own kind of advantage. And I think that is not a very difficult thing to do, a very expensive thing to do, but I think that is probably more valuable than many of the kind of efforts that we have to reduce the cognitive skills gap.
I have another question concerning sort of intersection between gender and socioeconomic status. Do you think social class plays a role in gender gaps? Are women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, do they face a double disadvantage?
I would actually say the opposite. What we see from our data is that actually boys from disadvantaged backgrounds are the group most at risk. Girls somehow seem to do better to overcome social disadvantage. They seem to be more resilient on many of the indicators for which we have comparative data.
Another question here, OECD analysis states that the correlations between attitudes and professional choice are weak and not necessarily causally related. Is this true from previous analyses?
Well, the causal relationship is problematic to answer because we just have, cross-sectional cohort data. But when I look at how predictive career aspirations are to actual career choices made by, another cohort, I would think that there's a pretty strong link between the two. Basically, what you can see is I showed you this example of, top performing boys prefer the kind of science, engineering jobs, and the girls prefer the health-related jobs. And then later on, I see actually there are a lot more girls going on into, into health jobs than boys, and a lot more boys going into ICT and technology-related jobs. So I do think actually that those career aspirations are highly predictive. Again, I can't prove the causal relationship because we're talking about different cohorts here, but at least the kind of synthetic picture looks pretty conclusive on this.
Another participant makes the point that um, in some countries, more men are needed in health-related careers. Would you have any suggestions as to how this could be achieved?
I think we need a lot more people in health-related careers, and there are probably a lot more men than currently in those occupations for which that would be a good match. And I think the question is not just to put more men into those occupations, but to ensure that the women and men best, match to those kinds of careers, see those opportunities and realize them. I think that's really the goal. You could make the opposite argument for teachers. Teachers is a job where we have a vast majority of women in those jobs, and there is no intrinsic reason for that, and it would probably be good for children in school to have better exposure to gender diversity. It would probably be good for many men to get into those occupations. The question is often, do they see those opportunities and value them? I think that's the idea is not to sort of oblige people to make certain choices, but to just ensure that the people in positions make the choices most pertinent to them.
What potential do you think elementary school has in equalizing gender inequality in technology specifically? How can schools use the potential to make girls more interested in technology?
Yeah, again, I think the early years are very decisive when it comes to the social emotional attachment to different subjects. So I think that's an area where schools probably should invest their efforts. They've done a good job on cognitive outcomes, but they could probably do a lot more to, create environments which attract boys and girls in primary school equally into jobs for which there is a great future. I think in general, one of the things that was most surprising to me when I looked at this data for career aspirations, not just the gender difference, but also that girls, the majority of girls in most countries sees a future in 19th and 20th century jobs. A very, very small share of girls at age 15 even sees the future of work, whether it is data scientist or, bioengineering or, those kinds of jobs are not seen by many 15-year-olds. Then you can't be surprised that they're not going to invest their time and energy into this. And I think that is something that we can probably best do in the very early years in primary school, because I'm saying this because many of those destinations are very cumulative in their knowledge structures. If you want to become, a data scientist or an engineer, you have to do well in those school subjects early on. There's no way that you can recuperate later on. If you miss one block in school, you're going to miss the rest of it. So those decisions that you make early in your school are very influential. And what we know is that, the choices that children make often are very much influenced by the people they see. If you the fields of study in which you invested most of your time and effort in primary school, they are probably not the studies to which you were, intrinsically disposed, but the one where you liked the teacher. You had a, very kind of encouraging teacher for this. So I think actually what we do in primary schooling is we probably underestimate the importance that has on destinations. And it is not just about teachers. It's also about finding ways in primary education to give young people exposure to the world outside schooling, particularly disadvantaged. If you come from a wealthy background, probably you've seen the world, you've seen different occupations. If you come from a poor background, you may know the job of your mother and your father and your closest friends and relatives, and they probably also come from a kind of disadvantaged context. So your view of the world can be very myopic. And again, I think this is something where education should put greater emphasis on.
Another Another question and observation. A study from Yale of 70 countries shows that in countries with more equity between men and women, fewer girls study STEM because they do not see the social function of STEM. This is also why there is no lack of women in medicine. How could we, the question is, excuse me for 1 second, I've just lost this question. How could we then address better collaboration and social function and put more effort into that instead of insisting on competition?
Yeah, I think both, again, I don't see the contradiction between the two, but I do think that we should probably, in general, do a better job in education to make sure that young people see the social function of different school subjects. I don't see this as dry kind of theoretical lessons, but that, everything that you learn in school has a meaning for your current and future life and for our current and future society. And I think and I don't see why that's so much an issue of gender. I think in general, probably education needs to do a better job to make sure that young people better see the instrumental value of what they learn for their success and the success of society.
Another participant says, in the Netherlands, the main focus is on boys who are behind in education, especially in secondary and higher education. What is your opinion about that?
Well, when it comes to cognitive outcomes, I think that's clear, the issue. Now you can see the big lack of boys and in literacy outcomes. But again, I think that's a very kind of narrow focus of education. I do believe if you take a broader look at the cognitive, social, and emotional kind of sides of things, you'll see that actually there are gender patterns in favor of boys and gender patterns in favor of girls. And I think we need to address them in a more holistic way rather than just look at narrow academic performance. Because the one point that our studies really show is that it's not necessarily the academic outcomes that drive the social and labor market outcomes, but those broader attitudes and aspirations. And I think that's something that probably needs a more holistic view than just filling short-term skill gaps.
In fact, speaking about early aspirations, someone also suggests that career choices are made relatively early in life. Do you think that the data that you presented today point in the direction that early career advice needs more attention?
Absolutely. I think some of the most important career decisions you don't make when you leave school. You make actually when you start school. Again, that's the moment when you choose which subjects am I going to spend my time and energy on. And that probably has a lot to do with, who is my teacher? What are they telling me? What do I know about the world of work? What do I know about those kinds of occupations? And again, I think that's where we need to start. And career advice is something that often starts way too late. When people finish their school, when they have made all their choices and when they have no way to recuperate. Basically, if you get, children in primary school see different jobs and careers, they may change their minds. They say, oh, this is so interesting. I want to work harder on those kinds of subjects. So I think we need to, rather than career advice, how do we get graduates into jobs? We need to look at career advice more and how do we inspire young people, from earliest, ages to see the world and with all of its facets, and then to sort of understand what they need to do to get to where they want to be.
That's about it. Thank you very, very much, Andreas, for your presentation.
Thank you for hosting.
And I'd like to thank everybody who listened in today for your interest in OECD's work on education. We invite you to visit the Education and Skills website at www.oecd.org/education, where you'll find all of the data and analysis discussed today and much, much more, of course. This webinar has been recorded and will be available in a couple of days on that website. Thank you once again for joining us and hope to see you again soon.